Thank you very much. Last week I was at the Royal Television Society convention in Cambridge. That's a pretty big deal event in the British television calendar. It's only held every 2 years. It brings together broadcasters, regulators, consultants, of course, lawyers, and politicians to talk about the future of television, and particularly in this converged world, what do we actually mean by television? Anyway, one morning I was walking to the conference hall, and it was raining, so I put up the umbrella with one hand, and I thought, well, actually, opportunity of 5 minutes to ring my wife and talk about the kids, so I put the cell phone the other, so I'm walking along, umbrella and cell phone. At that point, I tripped on the pavement, and as I fell, I put my arm out, and I landed on a railing with spikes. So I sort of came to with my arm suspended on a spike, punctured but not quite severed, kind of dishevelled, my mobile phone lying on the floor. I could hear my wife's voice saying, what happens? I'm sort of moaning and groaning. She told me at the time that she thought I'd witnessed an accident. In fact, I was the accident. Anyway, I'm lying there, and a man walks up to me, a member of the public, says, can I help you okay? Should I call an ambulance? And I go, no, absolutely nothing to worry about, boy. And I see sort of helps my arm off the the severed limb off the spike, and I'm standing there. And a woman reporter who's covering the conference walks up to me, and she says, "Don't worry, Stewart, I won't report what's happened." and I kind of thought to myself, what interesting folks we are in journalism. First of all, that when you see something happen, the first thing that crosses your mind is there a story in this? And secondly, what kind of story was it? Former news boss hurts arm on spike. It's got to, hold the front page. I suppose basically I'm a poacher turned gamekeeper turned poacher. I'm one of the few, I think actually the only editor of a national news organisation in the UK who became a regulator. And I'm one of the few, but I don't think I'm the only regulator who then went back to being a broadcaster, because this month I joined the board of Channel 4 in the UK as a non-executive director. And I've been asked to talk about the regulation element in trust. In other words, what role, if any, should regulators have in trust in journalism? Now, I should explain that I became a regulator after 31 years at ITN, partly because of what I call the dodgy competitions affair. Now, some of you may remember about 5 or so years ago, all the main British broadcasters got into terrible trouble when it was discovered they were organising either competitions or votes in which people were audiences were invited to take part and actually spend money taking part when they had no chance of win or influencing a vote because the outcome had already been decided. It was an extraordinary affair, and at Ofcom we fined the broadcasters, that was BBC, ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5, we fined them totals of millions of pounds for breaches of the code. But we also ran a sort of project to how could this be avoided in the future by organising, for instance, new codes, new rules about such competitions. And the project was called Maintaining Trust. And kind of, with hindsight, I have sort of misgivings about that title, because to me what we were about was really good old-fashioned consumer protection. We were about trying to stop audiences being ripped off by broadcasters charging them for things which actually they would never get any outcome for. In the case of the BBC, there was no money involved, but actually audiences were being invited to waste their time by choosing a name for the Blue Peter cat when the producer had already decided what the name of the Blue Peter cat would be. So actually, in reality, these media organisations needed to be regaining their audience's trust themselves. And indeed, the BBC Trust took a whole series of projects to try to put right the BBC on those tracks. But, regulators were keen to help, but actually regulators, in a sense, were there for protection of audiences and empowerment of audiences. They weren't there, in a sense, to sustain these media business in business by somehow falsely or artificially promoting their reputations. Now, for the last 2 years, I've had two preoccupations, really, apart from my work at City University. One I could describe as the Leveson process and associated industries, and the other, some research I've done into interesting controversies in the past century in British journalism. And I've come away with an odd contrast, really. It seems to me that the Leveson process in the UK was about a search for what you might call regulatory precision or regulatory certainty. Now, that's partly because For the last century, the British newspaper industry had claimed to have a system of regulation, which actually in the end it admitted was not really a system of regulation at all. But this, of course, has to be taken into account where in the United States there is no such system of newspaper regulation, and never has been and probably never will be under the Constitution. And, of course, the globalization of international media, which means that national regulatory regimes are increasingly irrelevant. And my own research has shown that actually when you drill down into the detail of controversies, you actually come across the inevitability of regulatory uncertainty rather than regulatory precision. Just to look at the Leveson process first in numbers, 100, that's the number of pages which I and some colleagues submitted to Leveson in terms of proposals for how there might be a better regulatory model in the UK. 2,000, which is the number of pages which Leveson himself and his team published with his proposals. I was asked by The Guardian to summarise it. I did it in 70 words, and I did it by putting it in the words of the players. So, Leveson, the press, but not politicians or the police, have been very naughty boys. Your independent regulation plan is useless. Adopt mine. I can help you cut your libel bills via an arbitration arm, but we need a law to make this happen. Cameron, I like the Leveson principles, but not a Leveson law. Nick Clegg, I like them both. Cameron, let's have another debate to get me off this hook. And of course, what then followed was, how could we have a law that wasn't really a law? So now we have a new number, that's 2, that's the number of rival royal charters, which are both laws that aren't laws, to try to find a solution. And frankly, we still don't know whether we're going to get down to 1, which is the one independent regulatory model which everyone wants to end up with. Now, at the same time, I was writing a book which is called When Reporters Cross the Line, The Heroes, the Villains, the Hackers and the Spies, which I wrote with a colleague at City University called Jeff Hulbert and was published in the UK last week. And it's basically 13 case studies of UK print and broadcast journalists who got into controversy of one kind or another. In the hacking chapter, I look particularly at the blurred lines around both the law and regulation. And I suppose if I started this book project looking for regulatory precision, like I'm the man who's finally going to decide what is this line that should not be crossed, that we journalists always talk about but never define, I came away actually finding there were many more problems with that than I ever anticipated. For instance, look at the variables that exist within the law on a subject which might appear as open and shut as phone hacking. First of all, there was total confusion at one point between the police and the public prosecutors about what the law was. At what point was it actually technically an offence to hack into somebody's voicemail, and at what stage of their process was it not an offence? Then we have the power of the public prosecutors to decide the guidelines in which they might prosecute some people but not prosecute others. We had the power of juries. There's, for instance, an interesting case, the Ponting case, when a civil servant was clearly in breach of the Official Secrets Act, but the jury decided he had a good reason for doing that. And, of course, we have the power of judges. So there is perhaps welcome factor of uncertainty about exactly how the law works out in these cases. And in the case of regulation, lots of work I've done on regulation is about due impartiality. I, for instance, worked on a working party set up by the old BBC governors into the BBC's reporting on the Middle East. Was that duly impartial? But actually, if you look at the BBC's own history, it always shies away from defining what exactly due impartiality meant. What I discovered in the 50s in Britain, when the term was first used, actually when ITV was started rather than the BBC, what it appears to me was actually it's a way of enshrining support for the status quo. So when an upstart ITV company, Granada Television, in the 1950s, did programs which challenged the law outlawing homosexuality, which challenged the treatment of black immigrants in Britain, the regulator of the time, the Ofcom predecessor, the ITA, came down on a ton of bricks, claiming these programs were not duly impartial. Now, out of all of this, I've come down in the book to what I call Lee's line. Some people thought that was a clever play on the word ley line, but in fact it's David Lee, the investigations editor of The Guardian, who said at the Leveson inquiries, a journalist ought to be prepared to face up to the consequences of what they've done. If I do something that I think is okay in the public interest, I have to be prepared to take consequences. So I think regulation, if it has a role here, can help occasionally hold journalists to account in public places, whether it be places like the Leveson hearings. But actually, at the end of the day, it's got to be the media organisations themselves that have to take the responsibility, if they want to win public trust, to gain that public trust and to hold public trust. Thank you very much.